Welcome to Season 9 of the Life Giver Podcast, a place for honest conversation about you, your relationships, and the leader you're meant to be to those around you. I'm your host, Corie Weathers. I'm a wife, mom, licensed professional counselor, and many other things. But today, I'm here to breathe life back into you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Life Giver Podcast. We are in Season 9, where we are really talking about what does it mean to be in the messy middle of your relationships. By the way, did you see what I did there? I didn't say what my name was. I didn't say the name opening, which I just defeated the whole purpose, right? In the last episode, I realized I start these episodes the same way every time. And I'm trying to shake it up, but it's a hard habit to break. No, I'm glad that you're here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming back. If this is your first time listening to the Life Giver Podcast, welcome. Man, if you were to go back to Season 1, a lot has changed. I think when I first launched this podcast, it was the Military Spouse Podcast, and it's just evolved through the years, which is the reason why every season has kind of a different theme, different music. And yeah, it just gives me the opportunity to be creative. So this season we are diving into what does it mean to be in relationships that are messy and existing in this messy middle where there's a dichotomy of various topics. And so go back to the last couple of episodes to catch up if you haven't listened to those. Some of the dichotomies we've addressed already is how do you be in a relationship where you've got to set boundaries and that's healthy, but also extend grace. The last episode was about the duplex and what does it mean to work on yourself and honor yourself while also honoring the relationship and honoring your spouse. That can feel like a dichotomy. And I felt like given the state of our world today, I thought it would be good for us today to address the topic of things are not as bad as you think they are, and they may not be as good as you think they are. That's also a dichotomy. Those are also extremes that we find ourselves, especially in our relationships, wanting to have black and white thinking of everything is terrible. The sky is falling. My relationship is falling apart. We're destined for divorce, whatever that negative thought that goes through your mind in your worst moments. Or maybe you're the other person on the other extreme that sees everything through the positive lens of it's not as bad as you think. And what usually happens is we marry someone that is different from us, maybe even someone who's opposite from us. That happens a lot in a lot of different personality traits. And so you can find yourselves in conflict of one person saying, this is really bad. The situation that we're in, or the lack of growth that we have, or this problem that we're trying to work through is really bad and I need it to change. And maybe you're going, it's not that bad. Like, look how good we're doing, right? And I think in the state of our world that we're in right now, regardless of what your political views are right now, so much of the divisiveness online really feels like that too. It's this black and white thinking of it feels like there are some that are saying, yay, reform, everything is great. This is exactly the direction that we want to go. This is wonderful. And then there's another group of people that are living in fear that are saying like the worst, is happening and that everything is falling apart. And I want to remind you that the messy middle, which is where we have to find ourselves in community and in relationships, is messy for a reason. It is the crucible of being in proximity with other people with varying thoughts. And going back to those extremes that we started with a few episodes ago, go back to that very first episode where I bring up the grace and boundaries. I talk through knowing where you are on this spectrum of extremes, going down the road and knowing what your deal breakers are, and that we have plenty of, once you know what those extremes are, right? Using today's topic, it feels like everything is falling apart. That's one extreme. And if we go there, we're going to like fall off the cliff in that extreme of going into a pit of despair, right? And the other extreme is there's nothing wrong. Everything is great. Pollyanna, I think that's Pollyanna. Is Pollyanna positive or negative? I can't remember, but you get my point, right? So the positive being, I'm going to minimize everybody else's fears, concerns, whatever, and just say we're fine and that there's no problems at all. So once you know what those extremes are, that if we think in this black and white thinking, and maybe that's part of what I want you to get away from today's topic, is black and white thinking can really lead us in either polar extreme to a place of destruction. So going back to that first metaphor of driving down the road, if you are on one extreme, you're going to fall off the cliff. You're going to go off the road. You're going to hit the guardrail, whatever that means as far as destruction on that extreme. And that what we want to do is we want to be in the middle. We want to be on the road. There's plenty of space on that road. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It means it's a little messy and we're navigating. Think about if this is a terrifying, thought, but like when you're teaching someone to drive and you're like, just stay in your lane, right? But at least stay on the road, right? So the wider the road in relationships, the more we have some wiggle room, right? And so I feel like my metaphors are kind of getting crossed at this point. Maybe they're coming across confusing, but I hope that you hear what I'm trying to say here is that the whole point of finding those extremes is to realize that in relationships, we both bring truth to the conversation, that things are maybe not as bad as you think they are, but it's also true that they may not be as good as you think they are either. Okay, that's existing in the messy middle, and in the dichotomy of both can be true. Okay, and it's being aware of which side do you typically lean towards, especially when you are tempted to have fear about the relationship, when you feel triggered by conflict. Where do you tend to go? Do you tend to go towards the negative and the fear and the shame and the everything is falling apart? Or do you kind of lean towards the minimizing of all those emotions, maybe avoiding some of those hard conversations, maybe avoiding even reality that there might be a problem going on, and it's just easier to kind of live in this ignorance is bliss state. So being in the messy middle is being able to say both can be true, okay? And that's hard. I think that's hard for all of us. I remember first when I first got the award back in 2015 for the Spouse of the Year, was kind of thrust into the spotlight. There was certain people surrounding me that were trying to prepare me for talking points with the press or situations that I might find myself in. And I don't remember who shared this with me. I think there's been several people over the years that have said this to me. And I've also said it to other people, which is to remember that you're not as good as your best press and you're not as bad as your worst press. And that was really helpful considering, especially nowadays, there's so much hate online. And thankfully, I've not had a whole lot of negative comments and press, but I also don't go looking for it. I know if I look for it, I'm going to find it. I think I was a little bit protected in the beginning because I was married to a chaplain. And I think that, I even saw some people stand up for me that said, when somebody had made a negative comment that, God was going to strike them with lightning because I was married to a chaplain. So maybe that's protected me a little bit. But the point is that was really good advice. It was good advice, number one, to not go looking for negative things to support, validate, or send me into this spiral of negativity. But also that I needed to be aware to not believe only the best press that either I see coming out about me or that I put out myself, because that's not really reality either, right? And it allows all of us to stay in this messy place of even just looking at ourselves to go, you know what? I'm not as great as I would like to be, and not as great as other people might see me to be. And I'm also not as bad, or I'm not as problematic, or I'm not as much of a failure as my worst thoughts or that worst argument that you've had, or maybe the comments that your spouse said in anger. that we don't have to entertain those. We don't have to believe them fully 100% as the truth. So existing in that messy middle of things are not as bad as you think they are, and things are not as good as you think they are either, right? So maybe let's talk through that for just a minute. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. I almost could like stop the podcast right there. Maybe today's will be a little bit shorter because I do think that is pretty clear for us to understand. Practicing it though is harder. So I think let's kind of start almost like a bullseye and think about how we would practically apply this to ourself and how we view ourselves. And then we'll kind of work outward from there. So I think for most people, insecurity, fear of failure, but also fear of success, I think is true for all of us. And shame spiraling is definitely something that every person struggles with, triggered by different situations. But I think it is something that we all struggle with. So I love Brené Brown's quote, or the way that she defines shame. I say this a lot because I think that she just really nailed her description of it. But she talks about that guilt is healthy and productive. When we have done something wrong and we recognize that we've made a mistake, guilt is that conviction that we feel that says, I've done something wrong. And it actually is productive in that it makes you want to go and make it right. Like you feel like I need to go say I'm sorry, or I need to own that I made a mistake. So guilt and the conviction of guilt is actually healthy. And in our faith traditions, conviction leads to confession. There's a lot of debate on this, and that's why I like Brené Brown's description of shame versus guilt, because some people would say that guilt is not from God, but God also convicts our heart when we have done something that is wrong or against someone or done something that's destructive. And we should be paying attention within our spirit and be open-minded to looking for and searching for where I might have done something wrong, where I could have done something better. And so guilt, or that conviction, is healthy, whether we are searching for it within ourselves and find it, or whether we feel like God has brought that conviction into our heart that leads to confession, that leads to seeking out forgiveness or righting wrongs, or being humble and going to your spouse and saying, I could have done that better, or I made a mistake. Brené Brown talks about that shame, though, is not productive. It is the swampland of the soul. It is when we are targeting ourselves and saying, I am a mistake. So instead of the thing that I did, the behavior that I did was a mistake and I want to make that right, shame says, I am a mistake. And so you can identify shame versus guilt, and that usually shame starts with I am. So if you have in your head, I am fill in the blank. I am the worst mom ever. I am a terrible service. I was going to say I was going to fill in the blank with an MOS, right? But the point is if it starts with I am a terrible father, I am a terrible person, I am a bad whatever, I'm worthless, I am whatever. If it starts with I am, usually it's probably shame. If it is I made a mistake, or it's about the behavior or the thing that you did external to yourself, now we're probably talking about guilt. So that's kind of a beginning way that you can kind of discern which one is different. So the point is that shame will tempt you to go into a shame spiral, which if we're not careful, we will spiral in that shame, build a house in that swampland of shame, and just kind of live in that house hoping someone will rescue us. And that is not productive. It's not a productive way to live. And it has you in this house of shame, speaking lies and believing lies about yourself. And all of those are negative. And so it's really believing the worst of yourself. And while you may have done something that was destructive, that doesn't mean that you are a destructive person. Matt and I have shared our story of the beginning years of our marriage many times, especially in marriage retreats. Maybe we haven't shared it as much on this podcast, but we share openly and publicly that the first 4 years of marriage were just extremely challenging for us. We were young. We were the first of our friend group to get married, trying to figure out what our expectations were of each other, saying hurtful things. We also were extremely lonely, did not have a whole lot of support for a lot of reasons. But the point is we kind of turned on each other there in the first several years, and we both handled our frustration, our loneliness, our disappointment in different ways. So I realize now that I'm older that I'm an introvert. And so that turned into going more introverted and really going into avoidance, which really made Matt feel alone. And combined with, he had not found the military yet. He was still struggling to figure out what career he wanted to do. And things were not quite fitting. I think he also felt the pressure of being a husband and a provider. And so all of those things added up together, and he was really frustrated as well. And his response was to deal with that in anger. And so we both were hurting each other, him with his anger. And by the way, just in case I needed to give this caveat, I never felt like I was in an unsafe situation. It was really just trying to figure out what to do with our emotions. And so while he was struggling with anger, I was struggling with just kind of avoidance, going numb and going quiet, and that triggered each other. And the point is that what really helped, one of the many things that really helped us, is for us to externalize our behavior from who we were as people. Whereas the shame spiral would make either of us say, I'm a terrible spouse, or I am a fill in the blank, right? Matt, for example, saying I'm an angry person, which almost implies like he will always be an angry person, right? That's like living in that house of shame. Once we externalized it and said, Matt is someone who struggles with anger, that's an entirely different thing for us to tackle together as a couple, right? So when I work with couples that deal with, let's say, addiction, there's a difference between saying you're an addict, which I know that in the 12 Steps program, which I have experience professionally working with, there is some value to being able to identify with that so that you can really kind of dig your heels in and start to make progress in healing and learning to make good choices. So there are certain circles when you are with other people struggling with addiction where there is great healing and power and validation in being able to own that and accept it and know that this is one of the ways that we change that is to face reality and say, I struggle with this, right? As an addict. That there is some benefit to being able to say, instead of saying, I am an addict, as if I never have any hope, to externalizing it and saying, I am someone who struggles with whatever, fill in the blank, alcohol, pornography, drugs, whoever's listening to this, right? There's a difference between the guilt of, the healthy conviction of, I relapsed again and I made a mistake, versus I'm an addict. I'm always going to struggle with this. I'm going to live in my house of shame, right? So we are not as bad as we think we are, but there's humility that comes with, I'm also not as good as I think I am either, right? That's the messy middle of having the relationship with yourself. So if I swing over to the other side, away from shame, now I can have a conversation about, there are some of us out there, some of you, that maybe don't struggle as much with shame spiraling, but might struggle with pride. And I think I definitely can struggle with a shame spiral for sure. But I think that I also struggle with pride in that I was kind of always a rule follower. I really like rules. They give me the proper structure and boundaries to know how to do my job or relationships with people. And I was that kid that got good grades, and I was not the kid that would go to parties and get drunk, and so I just always was the rule follower. But I think that has allowed me more so to struggle with believing the best press about myself, and probably the reason why earlier in those years of marriage, why I leaned towards just avoiding the drama and the problem and the things altogether, right? So I think that some struggle with that shame spiral, believing the worst of themselves, believing they're bad press. And I think that there are others that maybe lean a little bit towards believing the best about things. And when you're talking about your relationship with yourself, that can look like really leaning towards the temptation of pride, which is not embracing the humility, not embracing the reality that you also are and can make decisions that are destructive, even if you are that rule follower. That's simply sometimes by being the rule follower and being rigid and being even trying to be perfect or having it all together can be destructive with a spouse who really just needs you to be humble and needs you to face reality, right? So when we are really tempted towards believing the best of ourselves only, we are not exercising the daily humility to face reality that I am both capable of making mistakes and causing destruction. And I also am capable of growing, getting it right, capable of forgiveness, capable of forgiving myself, capable of extending grace to myself, that I am not going to be able to get it perfect all the time. And that doesn't mean that I'm a complete failure. Okay. So hopefully that makes some sense, that as we have a relationship with ourselves, that this dichotomy is really important within our own relationship. That's what helps us get out of the shame spiral. And it's also what helps us humble ourselves so that we can face reality as we engage our relationships. So humility is incredibly important, but being able to rescue ourselves from shame spirals are so critical to relationships. No one can, please hear me on this. No one can rescue you from a shame spiral but you. Have you ever gone into a shame spiral and your spouse or friend or whatever is just begging and pleading with you, and they're just telling you that you're a great person, and they're trying to chase you with all these accolades and telling you it's really unfair to the other person who is probably feeling their own level of destruction and the conflict, who really need their own feelings to be tended to as well. Like they have their, especially if you're in conflict and you're going into a shame spiral, you're asking them to change the topic. If you're now asking them to rescue you from thoughts and beliefs that you are having about yourself, and you're looping in those thoughts, like it's kind of, I hate to say it, it's kind of a selfish thing to change the topic away from what it was that we were originally talking about to now, I need you to chase me and make me feel better about myself. That is your job. Okay. That is your job personally, to recognize when you are in a shame spiral, recognize what things that you are believing about yourself, and then pulling yourself out of that shame spiral and saying, you know what, it's not healthy and good for me to only think the worst of myself. Are some of these things true? Yes. Did I maybe do something destructive? Yes. Does that mean that I am way in this extreme of being a terrible person? No. So I need to pull some of these positive things that are also true. Here are some of the situations where I have been a good husband and father. Here are some examples in my memory of when I have been a good wife and mother, right? So that we are able to bring ourselves back to that messy middle of I am not as bad as I think I am, and I'm also not as good as I think I am either. Okay. So we're kind of all swinging like this pendulum, like a grandfather clock. We're all swinging back and forth between these extremes, trying our best to stay in that messy middle. So that's a little bit of your relationship with yourself. I think the biggest takeaway is, if you find yourself in a shame spiral, number one, identify and learn to identify what's the difference between shame versus guilt, and that only you can save yourself from a shame spiral by not entertaining those shame messages, balancing out the truths that are in your head, that I need to remember some of the other truths that are also good truths about me as well, to get myself back to the middle. So when we think about our relationships now, it can also be true that your relationship is not as bad, is not as in a bad state as you fear it is. And it also maybe not be as perfect as you think it is either. And that's really important when you're engaging in a relationship with someone that has a different perspective on that. If you think everything is fine and your spouse is saying it is not fine, then it's true. And we need to face reality that there is something that we need to work on that is valuable to your partner, that is important to them. And so therefore it should be important to you. And we have to face reality that even if we don't value that, or if we don't see it as destructive or as big of a red flag as they do, that doesn't mean that we should minimize their feelings about it and try to convince them otherwise. Okay. So if someone that you're in relationship with is saying, hey, we need to work on this, or I'm not happy, or things are falling apart, if you don't agree with them, it still needs to be a conversation. And maybe that conversation turns into helping them see, hey, I hear you. I am valuing and paying attention to the concerns that you're bringing to me. And maybe we also need to talk about that both things can be true, that we need to work on these things, and that maybe we don't have to say that we're in a devastating place either. So a lot of times I'm working with couples who will come, especially if they're in a crisis season. A lot of our sessions are, yes, talking about the hard stuff. Yes, talking about the destruction that has been caused in the relationship. But there's a lot of sessions that we're also talking about, let's cover what we've also done right. Let's also talk about the progress that we have made since you first started coming in. Both are true. It is both true that you're still dealing with the consequences of the destructive choices that were made in the relationship. And it is also true that we are making progress. And it's how do we live in that state every day between sessions? So it's not minimizing the state of crisis they may still feel like they're in, because that is valid. But it's also helpful to celebrate the things that we're getting right. So wherever you are in the relationship, whichever side you might take, depending on what the topic is, depending on what season you're in, it's just remembering that things may not be as bad as you think that they are. Like when you find yourself in a really big, terrible conflict, let's say you get into a really destructive argument. A lot of times I tell families, hey, let's get a good night's sleep. Let's go get dinner if we haven't eaten dinner. Let's put a pin in this topic and let's revisit it tomorrow. That is practically exercising a timeout. It just gives us a chance to calm our heart rate down, because Gottman has done great research that shows that when our heart rate goes up in stress, we are less likely to hear the other person, to make sense of what they're even saying. And we're probably just in a defensive mode and we're not going to make things better. So when we can call a timeout, and the acronym HALT, if you've not heard it before, hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. Anytime you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you're probably not going to have a good conversation. And you're probably going to do a not great job of resolving this conflict. So go address whatever that issue is. Go get a snack, go sleep on it. I have couples ask me all the time, what about that scripture of don't let the sun go down on your anger? I will tell you my stance on that is more that it is saying, don't let conflict and issues that you have with a neighbor, including your spouse, to go forever unresolved. Don't harbor the topic, the issue, the resentment, the cynicism. Don't allow those unresolved issues to turn into contempt. That is where it becomes really destructive. That doesn't mean that we need to argue until 3 a.m. so that it's resolved before we go to sleep. Healthy timeouts are incredibly important so that our brain can think more clearly. How many times have you chosen to go to sleep with the topic not resolved, only to wake up the next morning and look at your spouse and go, I'm sorry. Like, man, I just, now that we've had a break from it, it's really not that big of a deal. Let's figure out what we need to do to get on the same page, hug it out, right? And move forward. And it was because we got some rest. It's because we entered into that REM sleep that our brain started filing things away and getting our emotions caught up with our thoughts, that healthy timeout helps you get into that state of like realistic, messy middle of, yes, we have something to work on, but it's not as bad as we were making it last night. Okay. So being in relationship with someone and being in that realistic place of, hey, we're not doing amazing and we're not perfect, but we're also needing to work on some things, right? That is being in the messy middle in relationships. So take that wherever you are and wherever you find yourself landing, whether that means you going to your spouse today or this week and saying, hey, I have probably minimized your emotions more than I meant to. And I'm so sorry that you were trying to bring me a problem that is valuable to you and concerning to you, and I dismissed it. And I need to step into reality and humble myself and realize that if you feel that things are not where you want them to be, or if you feel like you are unhappy, then that is important enough that we will figure out how to work on this together. Maybe you need to say that to your spouse this week. Or maybe you're on the other side and maybe you go to your spouse this week and say, hey, I know that my fear and insecurity, maybe even my struggles in attachment and understanding love and healthy attachment based off maybe your childhood upbringing and what you saw love mean, what you saw attachments mean. Maybe you grew up in neglect or an abusive home, makes you feel very insecure and very unstable when conflict comes up and it feels like this fear all of a sudden that you're going to lose the whole relationship, right? Maybe you need to go to your spouse this week and say, I know that I'm very sensitive to conflict. And when conflict happens, I'm afraid the sky is falling and I'm afraid I'm going to lose this relationship or I'm afraid of being abandoned. And so I launch into panic mode and I think everything is falling apart when really you've been very stable for me. And our relationship is better than I sometimes give us credit for. Things are not probably as bad as you think they are, and they're probably not as good as you think they are either. And the messy middle is we come together and we hear what both people are saying. It's very likely that what both of you are saying has truth in it. So I do this with great hesitancy, but let's open up this even more outside of our marriages and talk about, you can apply this to your family relationships. You can apply this to the nation right now. There is so much division. There's so much fear and insecurity with the changing of administrations, all the executive orders that are coming out. Even I am tempted to swing to one extreme or the other. And I have been having to say this even to myself as I've been watching the news play out. If you are in the military, especially active, like our family is, this is hitting very personally. There are a lot of changes coming, whether you are excited about those changes or not. Change can be difficult and it can create a lot of fear and insecurity. I'll be honest and say that even the DEI changes in the executive order affects spouses. The spouse preference to be able to get a federal job counts as part of the DEI programming. And so when you have our community of spouses that have an unemployment rate close to 30%, either under or over, hovering all the time at 30%, and we had now spouse preference that our resumes would get looked at. And again, we would only get jobs if we were qualified to get the jobs, but it gave spouses an opportunity to maybe get hired in the government a little bit easier. That was one of the programs chopped in the DEI programming executive order. And so for a lot of people right now, there's a lot of things that are personal that are affecting them. And it can trigger a lot of insecurity and fear for many people. And so even I, in thinking about the spouse stuff, there's been a lot of issues with TRICARE, TriWest, and that changing of contract. There's just a lot of, and I've said on the podcast before, I have low adaptability on the strength finder. So change is hard for me in general. When everything is changing at once, that can trigger a lot of insecurity in me, and I can go through any number of emotions. But for many of us, on the military side, on the active duty side, there are certain decisions, there are certain changes that affect us individually or affect us personally. And it can be really easy to go, the sky is falling, everything is terrible. Where is this going, right? Everything is terrible. And it doesn't feel very validating, and it doesn't feel like reality if there are other people that are saying, isn't everything wonderful? Isn't this great? We've been wanting change for a long time and now it's changing. Neither of those are true to the other party. And so the messy middle is being able to acknowledge that there's truths on both sides, that some of these changes that impact real people, real humans in your neighborhood and the people that you serve with and in their families, that it's true for them that they're feeling insecure, that they are feeling that there might be too much change, that they don't like these changes, that they don't agree with those changes. And that can be true. And it can be true to them. And it can also be true to other people who have wanted reform for a long time, that have wanted to see change for a long time, whether they're in the military or civilian, that they made choices, whether it's to vote in the administration or whether they just agree with some of those changes and reform, that to them, everything is heading in a better direction, in the right direction. The messy middle is being able to hold both of those at once and saying the reality is, the bigger truth is, the higher truth is, both of us are right. That things are not great and it's triggering a lot of insecurity, and that change is sometimes helpful or necessary, and if we've been asking for change. And so I'm not here to offer a political statement on either side, but I am here to say, as we engage in relationships with family members, with civilians, with our neighbors, with our communities, that if we can exist in the messy middle and validate and affirm and find those close circles, not to silo yourself and isolate yourself in a further echo chamber. I'm not saying that, but it is healthy and important to find your community where you can find a place where you can be honest, where you can vent, where you can talk about whatever's coming up for you. That is important. And it's important now more than ever that you have a place to talk about that. And also, we need to be around other people that can hear what you need to say and that you can hear what they need to say. And these conversations are going to bring up conflict, and they are going to feel messy, because that is what it looks like to live in the messy middle. Now, I can hear some of you already that are going, I don't need more drama in my life and I don't need more messiness. And so I'm just going to avoid it altogether. And that's okay. There are some times where we need to rest and we need to recuperate from being constantly in drama and constantly in a state of living and navigating in that messiness. That's why self-care is so important. That's why maybe your faith disciplines are so important. Whatever it is that helps you feel grounded and helps you have that better relationship with yourself and honoring yourself and finding your words, that's really important. So I'm not saying we need to be engaging in conflict all the time. What I am saying, though, is that, again, that goes back to the messiness of what it means to be well, that we are not created to live on an island and be by ourselves either. So while it's okay to retreat and take care of yourself, we are far better humans when we are in community with other people than when we are left by ourselves. And our culture is becoming so individualistic that we are changing the way that we do life, the way that we relate, the way that we work, the way that we do everything, that we would much rather just do it by ourselves and do it our way. We're seeing more and more people leave corporate positions and just start their own businesses and do their own thing, become their own influencer, whatever that looks like. And we are becoming further siloed, and yet we are meant to be in the crucible of relationships. In that crucible of, dare I use the word diversity, of just thought and opinion, where I think the word diversity is going to be another word like resilience in the military, where we all just begin to hate that word because there's just so much loaded around it. But my point is that at some point you're going to have to re-engage in the messiness of relationships in order to be a healthy person yourself, and also in order to grow. You just can't avoid it. And in order to do that, we're going to have to face the reality that things are not as bad as you might think they are, and things are not as good as you think they are either. For now, maybe we can say of our nation even that at least right now, with all of the things that have been said about this administration, maybe we can say that Trump is not the next Hitler. And it's also true to say that if he makes certain decisions that are very similar to what Hitler did, that feels also very unsafe. That both things can be true, right? That right now, as I'm recording this on January 28th, that things are maybe not as bad as we think they are, and they're not as good as we think they are either. And that's the danger of listening to news cycles that cater to one extreme or the other, that further divide us. So stepping away from politics, for example, and looking at your own relationships around you, how can you look at yourself, but more importantly, maybe for this conversation, looking at your relationship and stay in that healthy, realistic place of reality that there are things to work on, and also things are not falling apart. So today's is going to be a little bit shorter, and I hope that makes sense for you. Practically speaking, what I would encourage you to do is go and acknowledge your spouse's perspective on what they've been trying to bring to you if it is the opposite of how you tend to think. That would be number one. Start conversation and say, I may not feel exactly how you feel, but I do value what you have been trying to tell me. And that sometimes we need our spouse to be opposite from us, not only to grow, but also so that we can wake up and see things that we normally wouldn't see. That I think, I said to a marriage retreat recently where I said, when you first get married, you love these differences about your spouse. The whole Jerry Maguire, you complete me. And then you're married for a little while, and then all of those differences annoy the mess out of you, right? So now they're pet peeves. And then you're married a little bit longer, and now you just really do not like these differences, right? Like maybe you even hate them. You've come to hate them. I hope that we're not getting to that place of contempt. But I will say the longer that you're married, and the more work you're willing to do on yourself, the more I think you enter into this sweet stage of your relationship where you start saying, I actually need you to be different from me. And I actually think that the latest stage of marriage is it's not just that I need you to be different from me, but I actually adore that you are different from me. And I'm so glad you didn't change just because I didn't like it. That would have been a really selfish reason for another person to completely change who they were, when really all along they were bringing a different perspective, a different viewpoint, a different set of values even, that really create friction against what we're bringing to the relationship. And those conflicts, those conversations, those differences, like I've said in that crucible, refine us into becoming a better person who can think outside of our own experience, our own wants, our own expectations, and start to see the world in lots of different ways. So practically, I would just say your homework is to go and talk to your spouse if you need to. Allow yourself to be a little bit more open-minded to what other people might be feeling in the community, or in your family, or in your neighborhood, or whatever. Definitely try to unsilo yourself from information that would cause you to think one extreme or the other, especially if it's going to lead you towards destructive thoughts. and destructive thoughts that would make you either a victim or make you see the other person as the enemy, and really try to step into and engage the curiosity, the wonder of being in the middle and listening for the truth that someone else is trying to show you. And hopefully that turns into a relationship where you can share your truth with them as well. Last, I would just say, wherever you are today and how you view yourself, if you have been in a shame spiral, if you have been beating yourself up lately, can I just speak to you personally today and just say, you're not as bad as you think you are. You are not everything that those lies inside your head and inside your spirit have been whispering to you and beating you up and telling you all of whatever it is, whether you're hearing things like, you're no good, you're never going to succeed, you are too awkward, you are too confident, you are too whatever, like whatever those whispers are that have made you want to isolate yourself, they're not all true. Are there some things you could work on? Absolutely. All of us have things we need to work on. And yet it's also not okay for us to change everything about ourselves just so that other people accept us. It has to start with you accepting yourself first. So you're not all the lies that are circulating and looping in your head today. And you're also not your best press either. If you're stepping into that place where you're just, man, look at me killing it. Look at me succeeding. You know what? We've got to be careful to not believe those things either. We are capable of making mistakes. We are capable of getting off track. We are capable of being destructive, even in our success and our prideful thinking. The second we start thinking we have power is probably a red flag. And you probably need to be careful with that. And that's where we need to step back into reality, even better surrounding yourself with people who will remind you of what reality actually is, which is you're not as great as your best press either. Thank you guys for listening. I hope this was helpful. And we'll see what next week brings as far as the next dichotomy as we navigate living in the messy middle in these black and white extremes of how to do relationships without going to one extreme or the other in ways that create destruction in our life and also in destruction in our relationships. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you for listening to the Life Giver podcast. Please leave a review, share this episode with your friends, and send me a voice message or connect with me on Substack. You can find out more about me using links in the show notes.